Now that the channel is 1 year old, I thought about making a video that differs from my usual stuff, which is mostly me praising or exploring weekly Shonen Jump manga. So let's talk about bad Shonen Jump manga, or ones that I don't like very much, alongside exploring the idea of what a worst manga is. Originally, I wanted to make a top 10 worst Shonen Jump manga, but I found this idea too restrictive and kind of boring, because my honest answer would have been to list some pretty miserable, boring, and unfinished works as my top 10 worst manga. While I still want to mention the majority of what would be in my top 10, I also want to touch on different kinds of worst manga because it's very easy for anyone to point to a manga they dislike from Jump and say it's the worst. It happens all the time with a lot of big series which are pretty competent, as well as recent axes, which aren't great, but I usually wouldn't ever call them the worst. It makes me laugh a bit since I guess having read so many Jump manga, when someone says something like Doron Dororon or Icehead Guild is the worst Jump manga, to me those are perfectly fine and kind of enjoyable compared to what's actually at the bottom of the barrel. And that's another point, this is mostly subjective in my opinion, but still I want this to be an exercise in thinking a bit more about why we consider a manga to be the worst. With that out of the way, let's address Hitman Reborn, since it's by far the most controversial take I'm going to have here, and probably the reason at least a few people clicked on this video and maybe even commented about it without even watching. While not as well known as other big shonen contemporaries, Reborn ran for over 400 chapters, which is staggeringly long compared to the vast majority of other titles that have run in the magazine, and it's this metric, its length. This is why it's one of my worst Jump manga. Unlike the other series on this list, Reborn is much longer and has some pedigree to it, but I don't think it comes close to matching up with most of the other long manga in the magazine. Reading it was quite frankly a chore most of the time for a few reasons. Some are out of its control, like the scan and translation quality, since it was never fully completed officially in English, but other negatives I have about Reborn are from its core construction. Surprisingly, I'm fine with this initial comedy arc. It's when the battle elements get introduced it begins to struggle. A lot of the fights just lacked impact for me, feeling very cookie cutter, like they had to make a bunch of fights for each character, leading to the sidecasts feeling a bit weak and all of the arcs bloated. The heroes do get better over time and I did come to like most of them, but I very rarely cared about its villains. The future arc might be one of the lowest points for me, with its initial ideas seeming really cool, only for it to fumble a lot. New characters are introduced feeling very one note, and I don't think it really took advantage of its unique setting enough. Another big issue I have is the general sexism Reborn has. The main female cast are pitifully underutilized and are often put into babysitting or cooking roles. It left a bad taste in my mouth, and I don't really even want to touch on Chrome, but her character is all types of icky, with her relationship with one of the main antagonists being a prime source of just horrible cringe for me. She's also constantly objectified and it's not fun. Out of the big shonen manga from Jump, so far Reborn is probably my most disliked, and I generally try to lower people's expectations of it going in. As for me, I was super excited to begin it, and it seemed like it had everything going for it. A strong fan base who love it, really cool artwork, and this idea of it being a pillar of 2000s and 2010s Jump. It just ended up falling short of all of that for me, and is the worst in these regards, for being disappointing and for having such a big time commitment I had to do to read it all, which in the end wasn't really worth it.
My disappointment is immeasurable, and my day is ruined.
Now onto a manga I can confidently say is actually really bad, and it's also one of the newer ones I agree with when people bring it up as one of the worst. Our Blood Oath. As a big fan of vampires and vampire media in general, I think you usually get two kinds of vampire stories. Very good ones full of thematic depth and emotion, or absolute piles of shit like Vampire Knight, but at least Vampire Knight is oddly funny and charming. Our Blood Oath, on the other hand, is just kind of pathetic.
Have you woken, Yuki? Do you remember who I am?
This man, he's my older brother.
For Following two vampire brothers who go around in a Monster of the Week style format, it attempts to try to interweave a narrative about family, from what I remember, but lacks coherence and is tonally all over the place, with its sweeter aspects and horror clashing like oil and water. I'm not saying you can't have horror and then nice slice of life aspects, Our Blood Oath just doesn't handle them very well. I remember its later character introductions coming out of left field and it being incomprehensible at times, and for an Axe manga it started to introduce a lot near its end, making it even messier than it already was. Pair this with some mostly mediocre art and character design, as well as it taking zero advantage of any vampiric concepts or themes, and you get a really dull mess. Our Blood Oath is definitely one of the worst jump manga I've read, and the worst recent example. It's also sold very poorly, but that's to be expected with a lot of manga I'll be mentioning, with worst selling definitely being a strong reason to consider a manga to be one of the worst in Jump. Next up, we have a bit of a speed round. During the late 2000s and early 2010s, Jump serialized a lot of football manga. Sports duds littered the 2000s, but in particular this period of time had a concentrated number of football flops, which include Meister at 10 chapters, Shonen Shiku at 15, Light Wing at 22, Doi Sol at 17, and if we push our time frame later into the 2010s, we also have Tokyo Wonder Boys with 10 chapters, and Ole Golazo at 12. These are all football manga that I honestly struggled in hindsight to differentiate from each other. It doesn't help that the majority aren't fully translated or even have more than one chapter available in English, but none of them captured my attention or laid the groundwork for a fun sports series in my opinion. And it's not that I don't like sports series, since I think some of the more recent ones Jump has had are very good, and the last football manga, Shudan, was really enjoyable for me too. The truth is, if I made a top 10 worst Shonen Jump manga list, a substantial portion of it would probably be made up out of these football series, since they're lacking in anything for me. They also showcase how little time Jump will wait for sports series to blossom, and perhaps why, before 2023, we were in a bit of a drought for sports series in the magazine, because a lot of what came before it wasn't great, aside from the occasional big hits like IQ. There's definitely a case to be made that worst can also equate to something being boring or unoriginal, especially when we're talking about media, because what's the point of experiencing something you've already seen before over and over again that's also not done well? Samurai 8 is the other big name of this list that's a pretty well disliked manga, although some Kishimoto diehards can be found defending it now and again. Samurai 8 has some serious problems with info dumping and exposition. It's constantly trying to build out its world almost entirely through telling and not showing. The artwork is another thing I don't like. It's not bad in a traditional sense, but it's way too white. There's no balance of light and darks, and all the thin lines which are meant to add detail everywhere just make it look messy. Everything blurs together and nothing is really given space to breathe on a page. Another major gripe I have is with Hyakimaru, or more so how he's handled. A disabled character as the protagonist is a really interesting choice, and if done well it could have led to all sorts of cool narrative and emotional beats. Sadly, the manga fixes Hyakimaru at the very beginning, meaning he's no longer disabled, which is not only boring but super icky. I feel like there should have been some commitment to the idea of him being disabled, or they should have avoided the idea entirely. This is one I actually dropped way back when it came out because I just could not stomach it in every aspect, and it is one I dread having to come back to because I know one day people will want to see an Axe Files on it. Samurai 8 might be considered the worst for poor narrative and art choices, as well as being kind of offensive with its handling of a disabled character, or at the very least very boring in its execution. If you're familiar with the channel, you might have noticed the Axe File video on SWOT, where I go way more in depth than I will here, but to put it bluntly, SWOT has one of the most dislikable protagonists ever. It doesn't know what it wants to do with its story, while simultaneously having a boring school setting, a boring sidecast, and a boring power system. It's also what an edgy 13-year-old would write if they got a chance to be in Jump. It's an all-around bottom tier Jump manga, and go check out my video on it if you'd like to hear me bash on it more. Musashi is a manga that's much older than the rest of this list, coming out in 1972 and written by Jump legend Hiroshi Motomiya. I touched on this one in one of my earlier history videos, but reading Musashi made me miserable. It's such a departure from Motomiya's first work in Otoko Ipikikaki Daisho, going from the charismatic main character of that work, Maikichi, to the titular Musashi. It's jarring. I honestly can't believe he wrote a character with so much riz for his first work to one I just hate with all my being for his second. The manga also jumps from place to place, attempting to be semi-biographical as it references the real historical figure, Musashi, but it's just messy in its execution and barely legible at times. The manga was also promptly axed during its initial run, and Motomiya continued working on Otoko Ipiki afterwards. This is the worst from a historical perspective, and an example of what I'd consider a good mangaka following up a great work with a really bad one that lacks all the charm from their initial success. If you've been in the wider Jump community for any amount of time, chances are you might have heard the name Chagecha pop up. It's, from my knowledge, the quickest manga to have ever been axed in the modern history of the magazine, lasting a pitiful 8 chapters. It's created by the author of Bobobo Yoshio Sawai and uses the same humor and crude drawings, but this time mixes in gang and Yankee elements. For whatever reason, it must have been pretty hated to be culled this quickly, and from reading it myself, it's just a mess both visually and in its narrative, and overall I'd say it's a very repulsive manga. Nevertheless, it will be remembered in Jump history as being one of the worst and shortest manga to ever be serialized within the magazine. Another personal stinker of mine is Sporting Salt, a manga about a boy who wants to be a doctor for athletes specifically, the premise sounding kind of original. I remember the majority of what is translated focusing on what wacky gadgets the main character could make to help out other athletes. It just doesn't seem like a good concept for a long-running series though. Its characters are also one note, and it has some of the blandest art I've seen in Shonen Jump. Art's quite hard to dissect and critique overall, but I can quite confidently point to its constant bland pure white backgrounds, blank-faced characters, and general poor quality drawings as an example of a badly made manga. And generally, even if a manga's bad, the art is still nice and unique, but with Sporting Salt and a lot of manga on this list, the art is more of a detractor than anything. This is an example of a manga so bland in every aspect, in its characters, story and art, and concept even, that it can't be anything but one of the worst. And finally, we reach the boy taking front and center in the thumbnail, Inumaru from Inumarudashi. This is a gag manga from 2008 focusing on a nursery school age boy called Inumaru and his caretaker Tamako. The first thing you'll notice is that this has one of the most ugly and poorly drawn art styles you've ever probably seen from Jump, and that Inumaru's junk is constantly hanging out, which is meant to be funny I guess, and is one of his central gags, so I hope you get used to it if you plan to read this manga. If that's not enough to deter you, Inumaru is maybe the most annoying little shit to ever exist. I'm not sure if he's purposely meant to make you angry, but the poor adults who have to take care of him are terrorized by him and his stupid penis jokes and asinine references the whole manga. I remember not really getting any references, maybe because of regional differences or a poor translation, but it's not funny in the slightest. From every single thing I've read in Jump, this little fuck is my most hated manga character and belongs in the worst manga in Jump. It also somehow lasted 4 years. I cannot imagine reading this for 4 years. I get that gag manga are subjective and comedy is subjective, but Roboco, Chojo, Kochikame, heck, I even like Ichigoki, they're all way better than this, and I'd even gladly read the gag manga I dislike over this. Things like Shigomaru or Mori King, they're still way better than what Inumarudashi is. So if you take something out of this video, I think it should be that before you complain or call something the worst manga in Jump, know there is a Lovecraftian depth to the bad manga within the magazine. There's manga I wouldn't even wish my worst enemy read. So hey, you might not like Jujutsu Kaisen or Kagurabachi or some other axe manga, but at least it isn't fucking Inumarudashi.
If I ever find one of these lying around again, I swear to fucking God, I will stop being so polite. Get the fuck out of my sight before I demolish you.
And those are what I think are some of the worst manga Shonen Jump has to offer. Of course, there's a lot more duds out there, and there's tons of manga I've still yet to read or flat out can't because they lack translations, but from the 200 plus manga from Jump I've read, these definitely stand out in one way or another as one of the worst. If you disagree and do like any of these series, please feel free to tell me what you like about them in the comments, or tell me what your least like Jump manga is. Hopefully no wars start down there. If you've enjoyed this video and would like to hear me talk more positively about manga, I have a whole host of videos on Weekly Shonen Jump on my channel, ranging from my history series, where I go over old manga from Jump's history, to the X-Files series, where I cover some of the less fortunate cancelled manga from Shonen Jump. I also have a Discord where you can come join and chat. I'll leave a link to that in the description. And thank you for watching any of my videos over the last year. It's been a blast to make them and to get my thoughts out there on Jump and manga as a whole. I should have a video covering the first anniversary of the channel and my plans for the future coming out alongside this one, so go watch that too if you're interested. As part of my first anniversary, I've also started a Patreon, so if I haven't driven you away with my bad takes on Hitman Reborn, consider becoming a patron. If you'd like to support me, you can for as little as $1, and there's a few perks that come with it too, but mainly it's a way for anybody who likes what I make to send me a little donation. A big thanks to Kinocha and Cody for supporting me on Patreon. As always, thank you so much for watching, remember to be kind, and take care.